The iron gates of Ashmoor Asylum groaned as Ethan pushed them open, the metal moaning like some wounded beast. Rust flaked beneath his fingers, staining his skin a dull, bloody brown. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, swirling dry leaves into spirals around his boots. The asylum stood before him tall and hunched like a corpse trying to remember how to walk. Its red brick facade was cracked and crawling with ivy windows, like blackened eyes watching from the void. A faded sign still hung above the arched entrance. Ashmoor Institute for the Mentally Afflicted. A final D dangled by a single screw. Ethan turned on his camera. October 12th, 2025. 9:17 p.m. This is Ethan Granger, documenting my overnight investigation into Ashmoor Asylum, abandoned since 1973, following a mass patient escape and fire. Locals say it's cursed. I say, let's find out. He stepped inside. The air changed immediately. Colder, thicker. Dust motes hung in the flashlight beam like ash. His boots crunched on broken glass and fallen plaster. Walls were mottled with mildew and peeling paint like scabbed skin. A water-stained mural of a tranquil forest stretched along the entry hall, ironic considering the building's history. Ethan took in a long breath and tried to push aside the gnawing feeling in his gut. Fear was good. It made his narration raw. Authentic, he whispered to the camera. They say more than 50 patients disappeared during the final night. No bodies were recovered. No survivors ever spoke publicly. Some say it was an uprising. Others say something was let in or let out. A flicker of movement to his left made him freeze, just a curtain swaying from the wind. He chuckled to himself and kept moving deeper into the administrative wing. His camera panned over shattered file cabinets, rotted chairs, and a moldy receptionist's desk. Papers still littered the floor, many half fused into the damp wood. In a nearby drawer, he found a keyring, one tag still legible, Dr. A. H. Kellerman, room 6B. Kellerman, Ethan murmured. That name was in the police reports. He was the chief psychiatrist, disappeared during the riots. He pocketed the keys and looked up. On the wall above the desk was a faded black and white photograph. A man in a long coat stood among a group of nurses and orderlies. His face was oddly smudged, not scratched, not worn, just blurred, as if reality had refused to fully render him. A low creak echoed through the hallway. Ethan turned fast, but saw nothing. Still he felt observed, as if something just stepped out of sight the moment he looked. He pressed his back to the wall, breathing slow. This is fine, he muttered. Old buildings groan. Wind in the rafters. That's all. But his flashlight flickered and didn't stop. He tapped it, shook it, slapped it, then it steadied again. His camera display glitched for a moment, just a frame, no more. But it was long enough for him to notice that in the split second of static, he was not alone. A figure had stood at the end of the hallway. When he rewound the footage, it was gone. Nothing but an empty corridor. Click. One of the doors down the hall opened slowly. Ethan raised the flashlight and camera, moving toward it. The plaque on the door read Patient Records, Restricted. Inside the room smelled of mildew and copper. Shelves were tipped folders scattered like autumn leaves. In the far corner, a single file lay centered on a rusted desk, untouched by time or water. He approached and opened it. Patient Eliza Wren, age 24. Diagnosis: dissociative identity disorder. Committed March 4th, 1969. Notes. Subject demonstrates extreme sensitivity to sound, vivid auditory hallucinations, and claims the walls whisper truths. Ethan whispered bingo. The file was thick. Dozens of pages. Scribbled margin notes read, underlining even a prescription list. On the final page, someone had scrawled in pencil, "The eyes see even when they rot." He flipped it over. A photo was paper-clipped to the back. It was a black and white portrait of a woman with dark, deep-set eyes and tangled hair staring at the camera. Her expression was not fear, not anger, something else. Recognition, like she knew who was looking at her. A sharp sound cracked behind him. A file cabinet drawer slamming shut. He turned, but saw no one. The hallway was silent, but now at the edge of his hearing, something whispered his name. Not once, not loud, but layered. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. It came from everywhere. He stepped backward out of the room, closing the door gently. Then he ran. Ethan's breath echoed too loud in the ruined halls. Each exhale was a confession the asylum swallowed and memorized. He'd seen things, already things he couldn't explain. The static-laced figure, the whisper of his name, the untouched file of Eliza Wren left like bait in a trap. Still curiosity gnawed deeper than fear. That file was proof. Maybe not of ghosts, but of something, some truth, buried under dust and time. His flashlight flickered again. "Come on," he muttered, giving it a shake. The light steadied. He had passed an old maintenance stairwell earlier. If he remembered the blueprints he'd found online, the records archive was on the lower level. That's where they might have kept architectural plans, patient journals, therapy logs. More about Eliza, maybe even more about Kellerman. He descended carefully, each step creaking under his weight. A rusted wheelchair lay at the foot of the stairs, overturned one wheel, slowly turning, though no one had touched it. The basement level was colder, the air thick with mildew and something sharper, a chemical tang like old antiseptic. He stepped into the archive room. Tall metal shelves rose like tombstones, casting long shadows in his flashlight beam. Some had collapsed, spilling yellowed folders across the floor. But others stood their contents undisturbed. He began searching. Patient blueprints. The label caught his eye. A row of long drawers meant for architectural plans. He slid one open and carefully pulled out a rolled blueprint cracked with age. It wasn't a building plan. It was a human diagram, a sketch of a woman's head and torso, but overlaid with arcane symbols, electrode markings, and notations in both medical jargon and what looked like Latin. Several spots were circled in red ink points along the spine and skull. The name scrawled across the top, subject W, Ren E. Ethan's skin prickled. The notations weren't diagnostic. They were experimental. Words like extraction site, resonant frequency, and interference threshold appeared alongside sketches of strange machines, one shaped like a crude crown of wires and screws. As he unrolled more plans, a horrifying pattern emerged. Dozens of these diagrams, all variations, all centered around Eliza, but each more inhuman than the last. One blueprint showed a machine attached to a patient's mouth, forcing it open to deliver sound waves directly into the brainstem. Another showed a coil of wire inserted behind the eye. On one, someone had written in block capitals, "If they hear differently, we must speak the language of their ruin." A cold wind passed through the room. That was impossible. No windows, no open doors. He turned slowly, and saw something that hadn't been there before. A chalk outline on the far wall, drawn in looping, childish script. It was the shape of a human arms, out legs slightly apart, but with 7 circles drawn over the body, eyes, mouth, chest, hands, feet. Inside each circle was a different symbol, none he recognized. Beneath the figure in smeared charcoal, she listened still. His heart thudded. He turned to go and found that the blueprint he had dropped on the floor was different. The human sketch was gone. Now the plan showed the layout of the asylum, but not how it looked today. This was an altered version corridors that didn't exist in the official blueprints, a whole wing labeled 6B, Red Ward. The doors were marked with dates and times. One door, at the very center, was labeled Void Cycle Entry Point. And then he saw it, a red dot on the blueprint labeled, You are here. The dot moved. It was tracking him. Live. He stepped back. The light went out. Everything plunged into black. He hit the flashlight. Nothing. Then the sound of shuffling feet. Soft, deliberate, not behind him. Above him, ceiling tiles creaked, scratched, dragged. Something was crawling in the vents. He crouched low, barely daring to breathe. He aimed his camera upward, recording blindly. Thump, thump, thump. The movement stopped directly above him. Then a voice, not loud, but inside his skull. You're wearing his skin. The tiles cracked. Ethan bolted. He ran through the basement, twisting through collapsed corridors, past forgotten rooms, and long dead lights. At last he found the stairs and climbed 2 at a time, bursting back into the main level. He leaned against the wall, gasping. On the peeling paint in front of him, fresh words had been drawn in charcoal, as if someone had been waiting for him to return. 6B is open again. Tell them we're awake. He looked down at his camera. It had kept recording, but the timestamp was wrong. It now read October 13th, 3:06 a.m. He'd only been down there for 20 minutes. So how had 5 hours passed? Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the camera. The timestamp still read 3:06 a.m., though his internal clock insisted it couldn't be later than midnight. His throat was dry. He tried to rationalize. Maybe he'd fallen, blacked out. Maybe the clock was faulty. But no matter how he turned it over in his mind, it didn't fit. He was missing time, and worse, he'd brought something back from the archive. In his pocket, folded tightly, was the altered blueprint. He didn't remember putting it there. Yet, when he checked, there it was. The red "You are here" dot had moved again, this time closer to a room labeled Auditory Containment, South Wing, a place that shouldn't exist. But if the map was to be believed, it did now. The South Wing had always been rumored to be the worst part of Ashmoor. Patients kept there weren't violent. They were the ones who whispered to the walls, who screamed at night about voices no one else could hear. They were called the quiet ones, not because they were quiet, but because something had silenced them. The hallway lights in this wing had long since shattered. Ethan's flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to see what was ahead. Doors lined the corridor. Room 12A, 12B, 12C. He stopped at room 13. Its door was slightly ajar. Inside was a padded cell, rotted and mold-caked. The floor sagged and the walls were lined with scratch marks, some shallow, others deep and ragged. On the far side, carved with terrifying precision, was a single phrase over and over. I didn't hear it until it knew my name. I didn't hear it until it knew my name. I didn't hear it until it knew. Ethan backed out, heart hammering. He moved deeper into the wing, now recording non-stop. His battery somehow was holding, as if the asylum wanted to be filmed. Room 17 was next, the hydrotherapy chamber. A clawfoot tub sat in the center, filled with dark, stagnant water. Rust-stained straps dangled from the side restraints for patients. The faucet still dripped, slowly, rhythmically, like a metronome. Ethan approached cautiously. The air here was colder. The camera lens fogged slightly. He wiped it, then paused. The reflection in the water was wrong. In it he saw the room, the walls, the tub, the door, but not himself. Instead, a woman. Long dark hair, bare feet, head tilted. She stood right beside him in the reflection. But when he turned, no one was there. He looked back. The water was now completely still until it rippled. A single word bubbled up from beneath the surface, whispering through the air. Ethan. The voice wasn't recorded. The audio stayed blank. But he'd heard it, felt it in his spine. He backed away, stumbling into the hall again. The camera now buzzed softly. Not static, but feedback, like a low hum behind his own thoughts. He turned a corner and stopped dead. The hallway was different now. Longer, much longer, with more doors than should be architecturally possible. And halfway down at the end stood one door, lit from beneath, room 6B, the door from the blueprint, the door with Kellerman's name. He walked slowly, the sound of his own breath loud in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in slightly. And as he reached the door, he noticed something carved into the wood grain. Only the Dave survived. He reached for the handle. Before he touched it, the camera lens froze, not recording anymore. Just playing footage he hadn't shot. It showed Ethan walking these same halls, but something was off. His eyes were wide, his mouth hung open slightly, and he walked with a limp. Then he turned to face the camera, though it was supposedly mounted on his own shoulder. His recorded self smiled, then whispered, "Do you remember what you heard before you were born?" And the screen cut to black. The real Ethan dropped the camera, gasping. He stumbled back into the wall. The hallway was now dark again. The light beneath room 6B gone. He scrambled for the camera, but it had turned off. He tried the power button. Nothing. But the lens slowly turned on its own, as if someone was adjusting it from inside. A quiet tick-tick-tick sound echoed from the darkness. Ethan turned. The door to room 6B swung open on its own. A dark figure stood inside, not moving, waiting. He didn't step inside. Not yet. But he knew somehow that everything that had happened, the voices, the hallucinations, the distortions of space and time, all of it started here. And to know what was happening, to survive, he'd have to go in. Room 6B yawned before him, a square of total darkness framed by flickering light. The smell that poured out was wrong, like scorched paper, rusted coins, and something sickly sweet beneath it, like rotting fruit. Ethan stepped across the threshold. The door didn't close behind him. It simply disappeared. He turned, flashlight sweeping behind, but there was no hallway anymore. No door. Just black, cracked walls that bled shadow. He was inside something now, not a room, a space that had worn the shape of one. At the center stood a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Its metal was clean, untouched by time. A tape was already threaded through it. The single red record light blinked, even though no one was touching it. A folded paper sat beside it with 2 words in heavy typewriter ink. "Press play." His hand hovered, and then he pressed it. The tape whirred to life, clicking and rolling. A voice emerged, not static, not distorted. His own. October 13th, 3:06 a.m. "If you're hearing this, it worked. You came back." Ethan froze. He didn't remember recording this. Yet it was his voice, his cadence, his fear. "There's not much time. The asylum doesn't forget. It loops." traps you. You need to remember what happened the first time you came here, not last week. Not tonight, I'm talking about 2005, when you were a kid. His heart stopped. He had been 8. He had blocked it out. His parents had told him never to talk about it again. But images cracked like lightning through his skull. A rainy night, a missing cousin, a game of hide and seek gone too far. The asylum had been boarded up even then, but they'd gotten in. Only Ethan came back. The tape continued. Kellerman wasn't studying mental illness. He was trying to map the human mind to a frequency, a resonance. Eliza Wren wasn't a patient. She was the only one who heard it without going mad. And now, so do you. The room rumbled, paint peeled from the walls in reverse as if rebuilding itself. A second tape machine slid out from the wall metal, scraping like bone on bone. A new reel was already loaded. A label on this one, session number 79, subject W. He pressed play. A woman's voice began. He won't stop humming. Even when I sleep, I hear it. I think it's coming from inside the walls, or the cracks in them. The tape popped. Then the sound of humming, low rhythmic, wrong. His ears throbbed. He dropped to his knees as blood trickled from his nose. The flashlight sparked and the room changed again. He was no longer in 6B. Now, he stood in a therapy chamber, but one warped by memory and madness. Furniture was nailed to the ceiling. Walls dripped with water that flowed upward. Dozens of tape recorders hovered midair, each whispering in voices not quite human. He looked into a mirror, but it wasn't his face. It was Eliza's, hair tangled, eyes sunken, lips twitching with half syllables. And when he opened her mouth, a dozen voices came out, all layered atop one another. You heard us before you had a name. Then the lights exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. The air trembled like a struck chord. Ethan screamed, but no sound came out. Only the camera still worked. Somehow, it kept filming. When he lifted it, the screen showed a hallway again, the real one. The one outside room 6B. The asylum was giving him a way out, or maybe it wanted to show him more. Because on the screen, something was written on the floor in red. You never left. And then the walls of the chamber peeled open like wet paper, revealing dozens of faces pressed behind transparent layers. They screamed without mouths, eyes wide and bloodless, all clawing at some invisible surface, all trying to reach him. One face he recognized, his cousin, mouth open, eyes bleeding. Ethan stepped forward just one step, and the reel-to-reel behind him began to rewind on its own, screeching backward faster and faster, the sound rising like a siren. A final message blared out louder than anything before. The tape ends when you remember. He clutched his head, and everything went black. End of section 4. The tapes that shouldn't exist. Bandasan Sancho section fee. The echo room. No etan kuai kung pai doi mat voisu dadabi koacha trong tam trimin vasu tontai kua Ashmoor vuotsawacha desela kuskau traudatsu ban muanti eptu kong. Pandanoi continuite. ChatGPT danoi tu yed voi de la section fi. The echo room fantiep theo trong kochuen. The echoes of Ashmoor Asylum. Trong pan ne ethan se doi dien voisu that king huang ve Ashmoor vachin bandan min. Moi tu bat tautronen kong the kuvanduok. Section 5. The Echo Room. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He wasn't sure when he had closed them. The blackness lingered heavy and suffocating, but then the light began to return, not as a gentle transition, but in sharp bursts as though the very fabric of reality was stretching to accommodate him. It was no longer just an abandoned asylum. It was something else. A living thing. A hungry thing. And the worst part, Ethan realized that he wasn't alone. A figure stood in front of him, just within the edges of the light. The cousin. His name was Owen. He hadn't seen him in years, not since the night they'd left Ashmoor. Owen's face was pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak. His lips didn't even move, but a voice, the same voice that had been in his head, whispered softly through the room. "You heard it, didn't you? You heard it long ago." Ethan tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't move. His body was frozen. The walls around him shifted again, pulling back to reveal something far worse than he had anticipated. The echo room. It was exactly as the tapes had shown, only now it was real. A large circular chamber with cracked mirrors lining the walls. They didn't reflect what was in front of them. Instead, they showed endless copies of Ethan's face, twisting and contorting in slow motion, eyes widening in terror, mouth opening in silent screams. Owen stepped forward, his expression blank. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You're the key. You always were. You weren't meant to escape." The air grew thicker. Ethan's breath became labored, his lungs straining with each inhale. The mirrors began to distort the images, each reflection of Ethan becoming something less human. The faces in the glass started to twist, blurring into horrific, distorted shapes, monsters that wore his own features, echoing his movements with disturbing precision. And then Ethan heard it, that familiar low hum, the same hum from the tapes, from the night he and Owen had wandered too deep into the asylum all those years ago. "It's coming for you, Ethan. It's been waiting." He tried to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. Every step he took only drew him closer to the center of the room, where the mirrors seemed to pulse, each one sending a jagged wave through the air. A voice different now sounded through the room. It was not his cousin's. It was something ancient, cold and dead. "You have unlocked it. You have opened the door. Ashmoor is awake, Ethan. And so are you." Ethan spun around, his eyes frantic. Behind him, the mirrors began to crack open, revealing hollow, dark voids that swallowed the room whole. They weren't reflecting the room anymore. Instead, they showed something beyond. An endless void of jagged lines and glowing symbols. The walls pulsated with an eerie light, and in the distance, Ethan could see something moving. A shape. It was impossible to describe, a shifting mass of limbs and shadows, a thing that didn't belong in the world, pressing forward toward him. A thing from the void, something that existed between spaces, between time, between minds. It was the one thing that Ashmoor had always been trying to reach. To awaken. The thing that had caused the madness. The disease. The distortion of everything that had once been real. And it was coming for him. The whispers grew louder still. "You cannot outrun it, Ethan. It's inside of you now. It has always been." Ethan collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. The sensation of something moving inside of him, curling around his ribs, tightening with each breath. He felt it. Something reaching into him, twisting his thoughts, bending his reality until it was no longer his. Suddenly, his mind flashed back to the files he had found earlier. The diagrams, the experiments, the machines, the wire coiled around his mind, the crown of wires. It had always been part of him. The walls closed in, and the whispers became roars. He looked around, but there was no way out. The thing was almost upon him now. Its long, unnatural limbs were reaching through the cracks in the mirrors, stretching into the room like endless fingers. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were an ocean of darkness, a mass of void and emptiness. And then he saw it. The truth. The horrible, terrible truth. Ashmore had never been abandoned. It had never closed its doors. It had simply waited. For him. For the ones who could hear it. For the ones it could infect. The hum began again. Louder this time. The walls shook as though the asylum itself was breathing. The thing in the void spoke once more. You're not awake. You've only just begun to hear. And then for the briefest moment, the entire room flickered. Ethan was no longer in the echo room. He was somewhere else, somewhere far worse. Ethan awoke to silence, but not peace. The silence felt loud, like pressure building in the bones of the world. He was no longer in Ashmore. Not the physical place, at least. This was something else. The asylum's mind, maybe. Or worse, his own now fused with it. The floor beneath him was endless, smooth, dark, like obsidian that stretched forever. Above, no ceiling, just a churning sky of shadows. No stars, just eyes, watching, blinking slowly. Each blink sent a pulse through the ground, and with each one, Ethan felt a memory shatter. His name, his face, his past, gone. He screamed, but only thought the sound. His voice no longer belonged to him. Ahead something floated, a familiar shape. His camera. He reached for it. When he touched it, the screen came alive, displaying one last video. A feed from room 6B. But this time, the footage was live, and in it he saw himself. Slumped in the corner, eyes wide open, mouth whispering the same phrase over and over. It's still recording. It never stopped. It's still recording. It never stopped. And beside his own body, something stood, tall, lean, wearing a coat or what looked like one. But the face was wrong. A hole where a face should be, and from that hole, a low vibration radiated. Not a sound, but a frequency. The resonance. The very one Kellerman had tried to harness. The one that had rewritten the asylum. Warping space. Bending minds. Turning the quiet into echoes of themselves. This was the source. The original frequency. Not just madness. Not just a hallucination. A sentient pattern. A god made of signal. And now Ethan finally understood. He had been the receiver all along. And now, he would become the transmitter. The floor cracked. A tower of mirrors rose beneath him, lifting him into the sky of eyes. Each mirror reflected a different version of himself, each from a timeline he'd never lived. A boy, a patient, a doctor, a corpse, a god. He screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. This was the resonance chamber, the final stage of Kellerman's design. And he was the last subject. The eyes above blinked in unison, and the frequency surged through him. Everything vibrated. His skin, his mind, his memories. And then a click from the camera. Uploading, the words appeared across the display. He stared in disbelief as the footage of Ashmore, the frequency, the figures, the impossible geometry, all began to transmit. Somewhere, someone was receiving it. The world would hear it. The resonance would spread. His final thought, before everything fractured. I wasn't supposed to survive. I was supposed to continue it. Then the mirrors shattered. The sky screamed. And Ashmore Asylum, both real and unreal, collapsed into itself. Not destroyed, but archived. Stored in signal. Waiting. Epilogue. 2 weeks later. A man sits at a desk. Late night, flickering screen. He clicks a link in an anonymous email. A video file begins to play, static, an abandoned hallway, a voice. If you're watching this, it worked. His eyes widen. From somewhere in the distance, he hears a low hum. He leans in closer to the screen, and then behind him, a whisper. What did you hear before you had a name? Cut to black.